Pope Francis revealed this secret to me before he left. What happened next was supernatural. Imagine receiving a message that would change your life forever. Claire always trusted logic, science, and what could be proven. As a nurse, I dealt daily with the harsh reality of hospitals, where faith often seemed to have no place. But everything changed when she was called to join the team that took care of a patient surrounded by absolute secrecy. What she didn't expect was to discover that that man was Pope Francis. At first, he tried to maintain a professional attitude, without getting carried away by the enormity of the situation. But at an unexpected moment, he asked to see her. Pope Francis looked into her eyes and told her a secret that echoed within her in an inexplicable way. Days later, a supernatural event challenged everything she believed. What did he say? How did something impossible happen before the eyes of science? This true story will surprise you and make you question everything you thought you knew about faith and miracles. Stay until the end and discover the surprising outcome of this moving story of overcoming. From a young age, Claire learned to look for concrete answers. She grew up in a Catholic home, surrounded by religious teachings, rituals, and beliefs passed down for generations. His mother prayed every night before going to sleep, and his grandmother always told him that God took care of everything. However, Claire was never able to feel this certainty within herself. Since he was a child, he had an analytical, questioning mind and was not satisfied with abstract explanations. As he grew up, he began to realize that many of the answers given by religion were not enough to satisfy his curiosity. Little by little, his trust in science took the place of the faith that was once present in his life. The choice for nursing came naturally. Fascinated by the functioning of the human body, she found something solid, reliable, and predictable in medical knowledge. While many around her saw the hand of God in the recovery of patients, she saw the precision of treatments, the effectiveness of medications, and the tireless effort of medical teams. Over time, his distance from the faith became definitive. I didn't see the point in religious rituals or prayers that didn't seem to change anyone's destiny. The church, previously present in her childhood, became just a building that she passed without even noticing. Claire was proud of her rationality. He saw faith as something outdated, an emotional crutch used by those who couldn't deal with life's uncertainties. I never felt the need to believe in something bigger. His confidence was in science and what could be proven. Until then, nothing in his life had given him reason to think differently. Claire never forgot the days before her father's death. The strong smell of medicine mixed with her mother's soft perfume was still etched in her memory. The small room where he spent his last moments was always in shadow, lit only by the dim light from the hallway. His mother held his hand tightly as she murmured silent prayers, her eyes swollen from crying. Claire, still a little girl, clung to the naive hope that if she prayed with enough faith, her father would get out of bed as if nothing had happened. I closed my eyes, put my hands together, and asked God to perform a miracle. But the days passed, and the improvement never came. The cough became stronger, his body weaker and his gaze increasingly distant. One morning, when she woke up and saw her mother sitting by the bed, her eyes empty and her hands shaking, Claire knew that her prayers had been in vain. The silence in the house weighed more than any words. People came and went. Some touched his head and said words that didn't make sense. She wanted to scream, to ask why God had ignored her pleas. It didn't make sense. If there was a greater force that took care of everyone, why would he let his father go like that? She looked at the small crucifix on the bedroom wall and felt angry. He couldn't shed a tear at that moment. She just clenched her hands tightly and swore to herself that she would never again trust something she couldn't see or taste. Over time, the pain turned into determination. Claire decided that her hands would never be tied again. If faith couldn't save her father, then she would find another way to save lives. He dedicated himself to his studies with an intensity that scared even his teachers. I spent hours in the library, absorbing everything about anatomy, diseases, and treatments. Unlike her mother, who continued to go to Mass every week, Claire avoided any contact with the church. For her, the only way to avoid further losses was to understand the logic behind life and death. Nursing gave her a purpose. Whenever I saw a patient improve after good treatment, I felt like I was on the right track. It wasn't God, it was science. Faith had become just a distant memory, buried along with the pain of the past. Claire was known at the hospital where she worked for her precision and absolute control. No detail went unnoticed by her. He knew exactly which procedures were most effective, knew each medication, and kept the team under strict discipline. She was not given to displays of affection and avoided getting too involved with patients. I didn't believe that an emotional connection could make a difference in the outcome of a case. For her, what determined recovery was the correct diagnosis, adequate treatment, and the body's resistance. Over the years, he witnessed situations that only reinforced his conviction. Some lives ended suddenly, without apparent explanation, while others continued against all medical predictions. Healthy people were carried away by silent illnesses while critically ill patients resisted for no apparent reason. For Claire, everything was a matter of statistics. He learned to accept that medicine had limits, but he never attributed it to something supernatural. Whenever I heard someone say that a patient had miraculously recovered, I felt silent irritation. It wasn't a miracle. It was a set of factors that could be analyzed and explained. Her professional coolness made her a reference within the hospital. She was sought out for the most difficult cases, as they knew she would not let herself be shaken by emotions. Her own colleagues admired her, but also kept a certain distance. Some thought she was just reserved, others saw her stance as arrogance. Claire didn't care. His commitment was to science and the lives of patients, not to opinions about their personalities. I always knew that his work saved lives, and that was enough. While some sought comfort and faith to deal with losses, she preferred to face reality without illusions. For her, the only real power was in knowledge and technique. Claire had always believed that life was made up of rational choices, but now she found herself facing a reality that she could not control. A few months ago, he received a diagnosis that would change everything. He discovered a fatal cancer in his body, and that he only had a few months to live. The cancer was advanced, spread to vital organs, with no possibility of effective treatment. The doctor explained calmly, but the words sounded distant. There was no room for doubt. His time was short. Unlike other people who entered that room and left devastated, Claire just listened, absorbed the information, and moved on. He didn't cry, he didn't seek comfort, and most of all, he didn't pray. For her, there was no reason to question what had no explanation. Life followed a biological cycle, and hers was ending. She even thought about taking time off from work, but the idea of spending her final months at home, waiting for the inevitable, was even more suffocating. If your life has always been built on dedication to the hospital, then there was no point in stopping now. He decided to continue working, handling each shift as he always had. If he couldn't change his own destiny, at least he could continue making a difference in other people's lives. He returned to his routine without revealing to anyone what was happening. He didn't want pitying looks, comforting phrases, or any suggestion that he should prepare for the end. The body began to show signs of the disease. Small aches and pains that were once easy to ignore have become more frequent. Fatigue, which previously only appeared at the end of an intense shift, began to accompany her throughout the day. Even so, Claire refused to stop. To her, as long as she was standing, she was still useful. The hospital was his refuge and his last connection to the world he knew. He took care of patients with the same precision as always, but deep down he began to feel something he had never experienced before. For the first time, I wasn't just in control. For the first time, it was not the nurse who was helping to save lives, but the patient who knew that soon, there would be nothing left to be done. The hospital was going about its usual routine when a buzz began to spread through the corridors. Doctors and nurses whispered among themselves, trying to understand the reason for the intense movement coming from the restricted ward. Claire, used to emergencies and delicate cases, didn't pay much attention at first. I thought he was just another influential patient who required confidentiality, something common in hospitals of that size. However, the level of restriction imposed on that admission was unusual. Direct orders from the administration were passed on to everyone. No one was to ask questions or try to access information about the new patient. Only a very select group would have direct contact with him. Curiosity grew among the employees, but Claire remained indifferent. To her, a patient was just a patient regardless of status or fame. Still, he noticed that something in this case was different. Security guards were doubled at the main entrance and in the hospitalization ward. High-ranking professionals who rarely walked through the corridors were there closely supervising everything. The atmosphere among the employees was tense, but Claire continued her work as usual, checking medical records and coordinating her team. Her focus was on the patients who needed her, not on mysteries that didn't concern her. During a quick break, he grabbed a coffee from the staff room and noticed that even the most experienced doctors seemed uneasy. No one knew who the patient was, not even some members of the main team. The name in the records had been replaced by an acronym, and all access to exams and diagnoses was blocked. Claire wasn't the type to get carried away by speculation, but she admitted to herself that this case was different. Something big was happening. The hospital was dealing with someone important, someone who needed to be protected from something that no one there could explain. Claire continued her routine without getting involved in the commotion caused by the arrival of the mysterious patient. Her experience taught her not to waste energy on speculation. as she knew that sooner or later, everything would become clear. Despite his professionalism, he could not help but notice the careful choice of the team that would be responsible for the service. They were the best doctors and nurses in the hospital, all summoned directly by the administration. As she was always at the top of the list of professionals, she expected to be included among those selected, but to her surprise, she was given a secondary role in this case. It would remain as a reserve, being activated only if necessary. She didn't feel offended or disappointed. His focus has always been on work, regardless of his position within it. But her personal demand for always obtaining the best results made her think about why she wasn't chosen. Did anyone know of his inevitable fate? In the first few days, he observed the movement from afar, occupying himself with the other patients in the hospital. I knew that the main team had direct access to the room, but no one said anything. Information was strictly controlled, and even medical reports were blocked from the rest of the employees. Claire, despite her curiosity, remained distant. She was used to dealing with medical confidentiality, and her professionalism always prevented her from seeking information that was not within her purview. Still, it was impossible to ignore the fact that this patient was attracting unusual attention. In addition to the reinforced security, members of the administration circulated the corridors frequently, always alert to any movement. As time passed, the medical and nursing team followed their routine with discretion, without letting any details about the patient escape. Claire continued to be busy with her shifts, but little by little she began to realize that something about this situation was different from anything she had ever faced. Secrecy was absolute, and even the hospital's most senior employees seemed uncomfortable with the lack of information. Her reserve role kept her at a distance, but an uncomfortable intuition was beginning to emerge. I didn't know exactly why, but I felt that sooner or later I would be called to that ward. The confidentiality surrounding the patient was absolute. The buzz among the employees grew, but no one dared to ask direct questions. In the corridors, there was always someone whispering, trying to guess who could be hospitalized under such protection. Some said he was a political leader. Others suggested a big businessman, but no one was sure. Claire, despite hearing these conversations, never allowed herself to be carried away by speculation. For her, the patient's identity did not change her work. Still, it was impossible not to notice the tension between the professionals, especially those who were part of the main team. The movement around his room was unlike any other situation Claire had ever witnessed. Nurses left the ward looking shaken, but revealing nothing. Doctors who normally carried themselves with confidence showed unusual respect when entering the space. Even the security guards maintained a more rigid posture than normal, alert to any strange movement. Despite this, there was no fanfare. The hospital operated normally, but that ward carried a different energy. It was a dense, almost solemn silence that seemed to spread beyond the walls. Claire continued to concentrate on her work, but little by little she began to feel something that she couldn't explain. Even without having direct access to the patient, he felt that his presence somehow affected the hospital routine. It was a subtle but constant feeling. It wasn't fear or anxiety, but something that caught his attention. Whenever I passed near the ward where he was, I noticed a calm that contrasted with the hustle and bustle of the rest of the hospital. It was an environment of reverence, something she didn't understand, but for some reason she couldn't ignore. Even though he maintained his professional attitude, he knew there was something different about that hospitalization, something that would soon end up involving his path. The call came unexpectedly. One of the nurses on the main team had to leave due to a health problem, and Claire was called in to replace him. The news took everyone by surprise, including her, who didn't expect to be triggered after so long just observing the movement from afar. There was no room for refusal. Her role was clear, and even though she wasn't involved in the case from the beginning, she knew she had to assume her position with the same discipline as always. He took a deep breath, put on his apron, and walked towards the restricted wing. For the first time, I would walk through those doors and see up close the patient who had been causing so much tension in the hospital. As he walked through the corridors, he felt a strange change within him. The anxiety that used to accompany unexpected challenges wasn't there. On the contrary, an unusual tranquility took over his body, as if that moment had already been decided long before it happened. The other nurses looked at her with indecipherable expressions, almost anticipating something she still didn't understand. Claire simply followed protocol, quickly reviewing her notes and absorbing all the information that was given to her. There were few details about the patient's clinical status, but the guidance was clear. Service should be provided with maximum discretion, and any direct interaction would be limited to essentials. In the midst of that intense routine, for the first time in months, Claire forgot about her own illness. There was no time to think about diagnoses or deadlines. For the first time, his focus was entirely on something that didn't involve his own condition. Claire was organizing the supplies when she heard two doctors talking in low tones in the hallway. He wasn't the type to pay attention to rumors, but the tension in their voices made his observation instincts go into overdrive. Discreetly, he continued his work while trying to capture snippets of the conversation. The words came little by little, interrupted by the doctor's care not to be heard. However, one sentence in particular caused his body to freeze for a brief moment. The mysterious patient, the one who was being protected with absolute secrecy and mobilizing the entire hospital, was Pope Francis. The shock was immediate. Her mind tried to rationalize the information, but something inside her refused to accept reality. He took a deep breath, regaining control. He couldn't let that interfere with his professional conduct. He closed the supply closet and walked down the hall with the same firm stance as always. But inside, he felt the news echo like silent thunder. The Pope was there, a few meters in front of him, surrounded by a medical team who remained discreet, but clearly affected by the importance of that patient. Suddenly, the details started to make sense. The reinforced security, the climate of respect in the hospital, and the way in which even the most experienced professionals seemed to deal with something much bigger than a simple hospitalization. Even trying to remain oblivious to the impact of the revelation, Claire felt something different at that moment. It wasn't a clear emotion or a change of thought, just a slight restlessness that I couldn't explain. All his life he avoided anything related to faith. Now, faced with the presence of one of the most important figures in the Catholic Church, he felt his skepticism being put to the test in an unexpected way. He tried to push away any thoughts that strayed from logic. He would continue his work as he always did. But for the first time in a long time, she realized that something inside her was starting to move in a way she couldn't control. In the following days, Claire continued her routine within the team that supported Pope Francis. But something seemed different. There was a subtly distinct atmosphere around that ward, a kind of silence that wasn't just the absence of sound, but rather a feeling of calm. Even though she was used to hospital environments, where tension and urgency were constant, she noticed that time seemed to pass differently inside. Nurses and doctors who entered the room left with contemplative expressions, as if they had experienced something beyond the simple exercise of their profession. It wasn't something they could explain, they just felt it. But Claire refused to be carried away by anything that couldn't be measured or analyzed. He continued his work with the same discipline as always, focusing on reports, logistics, and the functions assigned to him. In moments of pause, while reorganizing supplies or walking down the hallway, he noticed a lightness that contrasted with his own rationality. Some nurses commented among themselves that it was impossible to enter that room without feeling an indescribable peace. Others mentioned that the Pope's presence transformed the environment, making it different from anywhere else in the hospital. Claire listened but didn't care. For her, respect and admiration for his figure were enough to explain such sensations. The fact that he was a religious leader inspired emotional reactions, but there was nothing beyond that. Despite everything, no matter how much she tried to ignore it, something about her was starting to bother her. It wasn't just what people said, but what she herself perceived. Even without entering the room, even without directly hearing his voice, I felt a strong presence in that wing, a kind of silent order that made no sense. But he refused to admit any possibility that deviated from logic. He would continue doing his work, without distractions, without engaging in subjective beliefs or interpretations. As long as he could keep his feet on the ground, his mind would remain firm in what he always believed. The Pope was just a patient, and nothing would change his way of seeing the world. Claire maintained her commitment to the routine. His role now included organizing the necessary supplies for the medical team attending the Pope. It was technical work, with no room for distractions, and she treated the task with the same seriousness as always. However, whenever he approached that room to refill medications or adjust materials, he felt something different. It wasn't just the respectful silence of the corridors or the professionalism of colleagues, but a lightness in the atmosphere that I couldn't justify. There was a feeling of welcome that made her hesitate for fractions of a second before walking through the door, a feeling that didn't match her pragmatism. The days passed, and even without direct contact with the patient, Claire began to notice small differences in herself. Before, he did his work without caring about what was happening around him, but now he felt that there was a subtle change whenever he left that ward. It wasn't a conscious thought, just a remnant of feeling that lingered, a kind of peace that shouldn't be there. She refused to attach any meaning to it. Even with all the rational justifications, Claire couldn't completely ignore what she felt when she entered there. Whenever I passed by the room, I felt a strong presence even without seeing him, without hearing a single word. Something about it transcended her usual experience, but she refused to admit that it was anything other than the respectful environment created by the team. He followed his work with precision, ensuring that everything was in the right place, within the required standards. He would not let vague sensations interfere with his conduct, but no matter how much she tried to remain firm, that lightness insisted on accompanying her, leaving her with a doubt that she didn't know how to resolve. On a day that seemed to pass normally, the secrecy maintained so rigorously was abruptly broken. Within hours, the news of Pope Francis's hospitalization spread, and before the hospital administration could react, a crowd was already gathering outside. Journalists, faithful and curious people occupied the streets, some in search of information, others simply waiting for a sign from the figure they admired. Cameras were positioned at every entrance and reporters were broadcasting live, trying to capture any details about his condition. The hospital, once an environment of controlled routine, was now a center of global attention. Security was tightened immediately. Guards were positioned in the corridors leading to the Pope's room, and new orders were issued to the medical team. Access became even more restricted, and even some of the professionals who had been following the case since the beginning were removed. Any risk of further leakage needed to be contained. Claire noticed the tension in her colleagues' eyes. The weight of that hospitalization was already great before, but now it became unsustainable. Movements that were previously simple, such as crossing a corridor or entering a restricted ward, began to be monitored with maximum attention. Pressure on employees increased. Between one treatment and another, Claire heard nurses commenting on insistent calls from journalists, trying to extract any information. Some younger employees seemed scared, afraid of making a mistake or doing something that could compromise confidentiality. However, for Claire, the external chaos did not change her focus. The hospital might be surrounded, the world might be paying attention, but its function remained the same. Ensure that everything was in place, that supplies were organized, and that nothing was missing for patient care. Even though her name was known throughout the world, for her it was just another hospitalization that required professionalism and precision. The confusion in the corridors intensified every hour. Nurses hurried the steps, doctors repeatedly checked protocols, and security guards remained alert for any suspicious movement. Outside, the crowd continued to grow and journalists asked persistent questions of any employee leaving the hospital. The atmosphere was charged, and Claire knew that tension could compromise the team's concentration. However, something was different from all that pressure. Inside the wing where the Pope's room was located, the calm was absolute. Unlike other critically ill patients, whose room was often a space of restlessness and worry, this room seemed untouched by the chaos outside. Claire carefully observed the people who had direct access to him. Experienced doctors, nurses who had dealt with the most challenging situations, all demonstrated a serenity that made no sense to her. In any other case, there would be worried looks, visible tiredness, and discreet conversations exchanged in the corridors. But there, on the contrary, there was a silent, almost solemn respect. Even the most skeptical professionals seemed immersed in something that Claire couldn't understand. She refused to believe that the Pope's presence was responsible for this. For her, they were just doctors and nurses doing their duty with professionalism. But at the same time, something bothered her deeply. During shifts, I tried to better observe the behavior of my colleagues. It wasn't just the respect they showed, but the way they seemed lighter, as if something about them had changed. Even amid the stress, there was an almost palpable confidence. Some left the room with a contemplative look, others seemed silently transformed. Claire, who had always avoided any emotional involvement in her work, felt a growing discomfort. I didn't want to admit it, but I had never seen anything like it. Doubt began to creep in. What was going on in there? What did that man represent to those people? And above all, why did she herself start to question things that she had buried for a long time? One night, the hospital seemed quieter than usual. Claire was alone in the supply department, checking the stock sheets and reorganizing the materials needed for the following shifts. The movement in the corridors had diminished, and even the tension caused by the leak of the Pope's hospitalization seemed more distant at that moment. As he was labeling medicine bottles, he heard a soft sound echoing through the empty hallway. At first, he thought it was just some noise, perhaps a distant conversation between doctors or nurses, but he soon realized that it was not something common. It was a voice, faint but firm, speaking words I couldn't fully distinguish. He stopped what he was doing and looked around. The sound seemed to come from the Pope's room, but that didn't make sense. Security was tight. No one could enter without authorization, and opening hours were strictly controlled. Even so, the voice continued, paused, serene, carrying a tone that seemed strangely familiar. An unknown sensation ran through his body. It was a different discomfort, not one of fear, but of something that touched a part of her that she had avoided accessing for a long time. She left the supplies aside and slowly approached the corridor, suspiciously, looking for where that voice was coming from. The environment maintained the same tranquility as always, and there was no one around. Just that sound, which for a moment seemed to be directed at her. Claire looked around, trying to find some logical explanation. Maybe it was someone talking quietly in a nearby room or some noise coming from the bedroom monitors. However, upon checking his surroundings, he only found the same emptiness as before. His heart beat faster, but his mind tried to look for rational justifications. She took a deep breath, straightened her coat, and went back to what she was doing. But no matter how much he tried to ignore it, that voice remained in his mind. Something about it worried her, because the voice seemed to carry a message that Claire was not yet ready to understand. In the following days, Claire tried to put the memory of the voice she had heard that night out of her mind. He followed his routine with the same precision as always, reorganizing supplies, checking protocols, and avoiding distractions. However, something inside her seemed to have awakened, and no matter how much she tried to ignore it, small coincidences began to catch her attention. Whenever she passed through the corridor that led to the Pope's room, she felt a subtle change in the environment, a kind of light heat that enveloped her for a few seconds. It wasn't something that could be explained, but it wasn't something that could be ignored either. Furthermore, he began to notice the way people close to the Pope spoke about him. It wasn't just the respect expected from someone of his position. There was something deeper in the way the doctors and nurses referred to him, as if each encounter was something meaningful. Some commented discreetly on the peace they felt upon entering that room. Others seemed to have a type of silent admiration in their eyes that went beyond professionalism. Claire had always despised emotional exaggerations in the hospital environment, but realized that in this case it wasn't just about emotion. It was something genuine, something she couldn't define. Even though she tried to remain skeptical, Claire began to notice that even the simplest details seemed to take on new meaning. The way the main staff behaved, the way the corridors around that ward seemed quieter than the rest of the hospital, even the expressions of the patients nearby seemed different. All of this made her restless. She was trying to justify it rationally, telling herself that it was just a reflection of the influence of a religious leader. But deep down, something in her knew it was more than that. She just wasn't ready to accept it. That night's shift was longer than usual. Fatigue was beginning to weigh on Claire's shoulders, and the succession of protocols, checks, and adjustments to supplies demanded more from her than she expected. Even without direct contact with Pope Francis, that hospital wing seemed to consume his energy in a different way. She felt exhausted, but not just from work. There was a weight that I couldn't explain, a restlessness that didn't just come from the body, but also from the mind. Looking for a moment of rest, he leaned against the wall next to his bedroom door, closing his eyes for a few moments. Without realizing it, his hands found a small object forgotten on the supply cart. It was a wooden rosary, simple, worn by time but carrying an obvious meaning. Only when his fingers slid across the beads did he notice what he was holding. She thought about releasing him immediately, but something made her hesitate. He felt an unexpected heat spread across his palm, as if the object carried its own energy. A shiver ran down the back of his neck, not from fear, but from something deeper, something that his mind insisted on rejecting, but his body had already recognized. For a moment, he forgot where he was. The sensation was not physical, but emotional. A distant memory tried to emerge, something buried for years. Maybe it was the weight of tiredness, maybe it was just coincidence, but at that moment, holding that rosary, Claire felt something change inside her. He couldn't say what, nor did he try to understand. He just stood there, motionless, while his mind tried to organize a jumble of thoughts that he had never been willing to face. The buzz in the hallways indicated that something had changed. Claire, who was organizing a tray of supplies, noticed the apprehensive looks exchanged between the doctors and the increased movement around the Pope's room. It didn't take long for one of the doctors to take her aside and inform her in a serious tone that his condition had worsened and that a transfer to an even better equipped sector would be necessary. The news didn't surprise her, as she knew her condition was delicate, but something in the way the information was conveyed made her feel a different weight. Before she could react, she heard the sentence that made her freeze for a moment. The Pope had asked to speak to her. His first instinct was to question the logic of it. She was not part of the main team, had never entered his room, and was not directly responsible for his care. There was no reason for him to even know of its existence. Astonishment was followed by an uneasiness that he couldn't define. She thought about refusing, saying that there was no need, but before she could formulate any justification, she realized that her legs were already taking her towards the bedroom. His heart quickened with each step, not out of fear, but out of an indefinable sensation. He took a deep breath before walking through the door, trying to keep reason above any emotion. The atmosphere inside the room was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The air felt lighter, despite the gravity of the situation. Pope Francis was lying down, visibly weakened, but his presence filled the space in a way that Claire could not explain. For a moment, he felt a lump in his throat, something that didn't come from tiredness or the weight of the moment, but from an emotion that he had avoided feeling for a long time. She stood there, still, not knowing what to expect. She had never felt so small in front of someone, not because of status or hierarchy, but because of the serenity that emanated from him. And at that moment, without needing words, he felt that something bigger was about to happen. Time seemed to slow down the moment Claire looked up and met the Pope's gaze. There was a serenity about him that contrasted with his weakened condition. His face bore the marks of time and illness, but still, his expression was calm, almost as if he were oblivious to the fragility of his own body. He smiled at her, not with the kind of formality one would expect from someone in his position, but with the kindness of someone who recognizes a soul in conflict. For a brief moment, Claire felt a tightness in her chest, a feeling that didn't come from nervousness, but from something deeper, something she couldn't name. He hesitated for a moment, not knowing if he should get closer. His gaze remained firm, but at the same time welcoming. It wasn't invasive, it wasn't analytical, it was just observing her as someone who already knew her story before he even heard it. Claire, who spent her life believing only in what could be proven, felt strangely vulnerable in front of that presence. There was no judgment in those eyes, only understanding, as if somehow he knew the doubts that weighed on her, the years in which she removed any trace of faith, the silent tiredness she carried deep within her soul. For a moment, she wanted to look away, but something inside her stopped her. There was an inexplicable peace in that room, a feeling that nothing needed to be said for him to understand everything. Without realizing it, he lightly pressed the hem of his coat, trying to hold on to any shred of rationality. But at that moment, faced with that look that seemed to cross all the barriers she had built throughout her life, Claire felt that something in her was about to change. She didn't know what, nor was she ready to accept it. But for the first time in years, he didn't feel the need to fight it. The Pope began to speak with a calm voice, but with a strength that reached Claire to her core. His words were not generic or superficial. They were precise, as if he knew every detail of his trajectory. He mentioned her disbelief in the way she clung to science to fill the void left by the absence of answers. She talked about her father, about that 11-year-old girl who prayed with all her strength, asking for a miracle that never came. He said he understood his pain and his incessant search for logic in a world that often has no explanation. But the phrase that most disconcerted her came next. God never abandoned her, even when she thought he did. His breathing hitched for a moment and a chill ran down his spine. How could he know the silent anguish he had carried for so long? The Pope continued, talking about something that had been troubling her lately, as if reading her deepest thoughts. She said there was something inside her taking away her peace, stealing her days and making her soul heavy. Claire held her breath. Was he talking about his illness? Nobody there knew. She never mentioned anything to her colleagues, much less to the doctors who took care of him. The truth is that he spent years ignoring any possibility of divine intervention, but now, faced with that fragile figure, and at the same time so full of life, he felt that his resistance was breaking down. The Pope said that God always gives us what we need at the right time, that he speaks to us in ways that we often cannot understand, but that everything has a purpose, even when we cannot see it. It was then that he said something that made your heart skip a beat. She mentioned a specific night when she heard a faint voice coming from that room. He said that night he saw her suffering up close. He said he spoke to her and that deep down, she heard him. Those words made his stomach turn. It was impossible. She remembered the strange feeling, the shiver that ran across her skin when she heard that voice. At the time, he tried to convince himself that it was his mind playing tricks, extreme exhaustion turning into a hallucination. But now, he described details of that moment with precision. She talked about the way she stopped in the hallway, the time she spent trying to understand where that voice was coming from, and even how her breathing became labored when she realized there was no one there. She wanted to object. She wanted to say that it didn't make sense, but his legs were weak, his hands were shaking, and his throat was tight. She felt vulnerable, completely exposed. The Pope didn't need to prove anything, but he still described everything accurately, perhaps to calm his rational mind, which was still trying to resist. He talked about the rosary that she held without realizing it, and that at that moment, he placed his hands on her. She also spoke about the tightness she felt in her chest and the doubt that came over her after that episode. Every word was like a mirror reflecting everything Claire had tried to deny for years. For the first time in a long time, she had no answers, couldn't find a logical explanation for what was happening. Her eyes filled with tears, but she tried to hold it in. I didn't want to cry there. I didn't want to seem fragile, but something inside her was slowly crumbling. The weight she had carried for so long seemed about to lift, and that scared her more than any diagnosis. I felt a lump in my throat, a tremor in my lips, and for the first time in years I didn't know what to say. The Pope just watched her, without rushing, without demanding, just waiting for her to process everything in her own time. Claire, the woman who always had answers for everything, felt small at that moment. Something changed inside her, something deep and irreversible. She didn't know what it was yet, but she felt it, and this time, he didn't try to escape. Claire took a deep breath, trying to compose herself, but the feeling inside her was overwhelming. The Pope continued to look at her with that serenity that seemed to see beyond her unshakable facade. His look was not one of pity, nor one of empty compassion. It was a look that conveyed knowledge, as if he understood every broken piece inside her, every silent struggle fought over the years. She felt her inner armor crumbling, brick by brick, but instead of despair, she felt something different, an unfamiliar calm, as if she was being supported by something she had never allowed into her life. He holds Claire's hand for a brief moment. When he held her hand, Claire felt heat run through her body in an unexpected way. It wasn't just the touch of an elderly, frail person, but something that seemed to pierce through his skin and touch something much deeper. So, he said those words, with the certainty of someone who knew what he was talking about. "You still have a lot to do here, and a lot of people to help." His voice was soft, but it carried an immense weight, as if it were a calling, a reminder of something she hadn't seen until then. Those words hit her like a wave crashing against rocks, wearing away any resistance she still had left. Before he could react, his hand let go, and in a few seconds, the nurses took him away. She stood still, watching the door close, feeling that something inside her had also closed. But what exactly? What had just happened? The hospital around her seemed to continue as normal, but Claire no longer felt the same. A whirlwind of emotions took over her, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself not to have all the answers. She placed her hand on her chest, feeling her heart racing, and realized that the emptiness that had accompanied her for so long was no longer the same. I didn't know if it was faith, I didn't know if I believed, but I felt it, and this time, he didn't try to explain. She just lived in that moment, allowing it to be part of her. A few weeks have passed since Pope Francis's departure, and Claire tried to resume her routine at the hospital. Despite everything he had experienced, he tried to convince himself that nothing had changed. She avoided thinking about what she felt in that room, the words she heard, and the peace that came over her in her last moments with him. But no matter how much she tried to ignore it, something inside her was no longer the same. The weight she carried for so many years seemed lighter. The doubts that had always accompanied her no longer had the same strength. However, it was only when he sought the results of a routine exam that he realized that the change in his life went far beyond his thoughts. As she sat down in front of the doctor, Claire noticed the look of astonishment on his face. He held his exams, his eyes switching between the sheets and the computer screen, trying to find an explanation for what he was seeing. Finally, he said something that made her catch her breath. The cancer was completely gone. There was no sign of the disease, nothing that would justify its presence in previous exams. The doctor, in disbelief, insisted that there could only be a mistake and urgently requested new tests. Claire consented, but something inside her already knew the answer. As she walked through the hospital hallways, each step seemed to echo something she still couldn't fully accept. On the same day, Claire redid all the exams, following each stage with the coolness of someone who has always trusted science. Hours later, he held the new results in his hands, and there was the confirmation. The cancer had disappeared without a trace, with no possible explanation. The doctor, even more perplexed, repeated that cases like this were practically impossible, but she didn't need explanations, because deep down, I already knew that this was more than a coincidence or misdiagnosis. For the first time in her life, Claire allowed herself to believe that she had witnessed something that science could not measure, something that didn't need proof to be real. When leaving the doctor's office, Claire looked at the papers in her hands, reread every detail of the exams, looking for a flaw, a scientific explanation that justified the impossible. Her logic-trained mind refused to accept what was before her, but something inside her already knew the truth. The miracle was real. The memory of the Pope's gaze, the words he said, and the peace he felt in that room came back to him. It wasn't a mistake. It was no coincidence. After so long denying any possibility beyond reason, he realized that he didn't need to understand everything to accept it. For the first time, he allowed himself to just feel. Back at the hospital, without realizing it, her steps took her to the chapel, a small, quiet space that I had ignored so many times. He sat down on the last bench, felt his hands shaking, and took a deep breath. I didn't know where to start, or what words to say, but still, he closed his eyes and just allowed himself to be there. No pleading, no questioning, just a moment of surrender. She felt a deep sense of relief, reconnecting with something that had never ceased to exist, but that she had chosen to ignore. When he opened his eyes, he knew that that moment marked the beginning of something new. Days later, he decided to return to the church he attended as a child. The environment was familiar, and at the same time, completely new. He sat in one of the pews and listened to the Mass attentively, absorbing every word, feeling every gesture. He was no longer the same person who had entered there years ago, full of doubts and revolt. I had found a purpose that transcended any explanation. His life began a new phase, not guided by fear or pain, but by faith. The hospital, which before was just a place of work and routine for Claire, now carried a much greater meaning. Each corridor, each room, and each look exchanged with patients had a different weight. The Pope was gone, but something of him remained there. The miracle he experienced was not only physical, but also spiritual. The woman who previously clung to logic and refused any idea of faith now saw everything with different eyes. The emptiness he carried for so many years no longer existed. In its place was a new hope, a quiet certainty that she was never truly alone. As he walked out the hospital doors, he felt the wind on his face in a different way. The sky seemed wider, the city around it seemed more alive. For so long, he believed that only what was visible and measurable could be real. Now, I knew there was something beyond that. She was no longer the nurse who had come in there months ago, closed off to anything that couldn't be explained. The illness that was once his sentence was now his release, and with that, a new journey began. She returned home, and that night, for the first time in many years, she knelt down before going to sleep, not to ask for something, not to question, but to be grateful. Every moment of pain, every doubt, and every loss brought her here. What was once a burden was now a path. The Pope is gone, but his words and the miracle left behind changed everything. Claire left that hospital as a new woman, reclaiming the faith she thought she had lost forever. Thank you very much for following this story this far. It's a fictional story, but think about whether it could have happened. If this journey has touched you in any way, click now to like the channel and continue receiving exciting and inspiring stories like this. We have also selected a recommended video especially for you, with more impactful stories that will capture your attention and move you deeply. And if you want to dive even deeper into this universe of overcoming and challenges, we have a collection of videos with similar stories waiting for you. Just click on the screen and follow this journey of transformation. See you in the next video.